Hello, and welcome now as we come to the 23rd week of the church year. And let's begin by identifying what the readings are. The first reading is from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 35, verses 4 through 7a. The second reading, again, is from the letter of James, chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. And the gospel this time is again from Mark, chapter 7, verses 31 through 37. Now, as we are looking at the readings each week, primarily we're also following the story of Jesus as remembered in the tradition of Mark. And so it's a little bit at times more a kind of study of Mark's works and the way in which he presents Jesus than it is necessarily always just the section we're going to hear for our Sunday consideration. This time, as we pick up at verse 31, one remembers that we ended last time at verse 23. So you might want to know what happened between verses 24 through 30, and I thought that one might begin there because there is a connection with the material that is included for our consideration this time and what is left out. Last time, Jesus, you remember, had a challenge to the teaching of some of the scribes and Pharisees. And this time, and from that point on, Jesus moves to the territory of Tyre. Now, and as we will hear in the section for this time, Jesus moves out of the territory of Tyre. So, what do we know about Tyre and Sidon? That, of course, they are both today in what we know as Lebanon. So it is the territory to the north of Israel. And one finds Jesus there, and questions could well be raised. Why is Jesus there? And the episode that is presented by Mark, one that is picked up also by his contemporaries later on, Matthew and Luke, but keeping in mind that Mark is the first to include some of this material, and that later on, the other two tone it down a little bit or reshape it because of some of the complexities that emerge in the story that we hear, that we don't hear, but that is left out. What happens is, just to kind of say, where are we going? Jesus is in Tyre. Interestingly, he is completely alone. In fact, the disciples have to be called by Jesus to him, but where are they at this point? So that's a kind of interesting point as we begin. It's unusual that Jesus is pictured without the presence of his disciples to kind of pick up the teaching that he is engaged in. What happens is that he is in a house and he is approached by a Syrophoenician woman who asks Jesus to cure her daughter who is connected or influenced by an evil spirit. And Jesus, in effect, refuses to do this. In fact, he says, you don't give the food that is part of the children's table to the dogs. Now, why do we call this a very complex story? Because we generally see Jesus as kind and considerate and taking care of particularly the concerns of young people. But in this case, it is very different. Jesus is pictured as refusing as the story begins, as this episode opens, to heal the daughter. And that raises all kinds of questions, and in fact says, well, you don't give the food of the children to the dogs. Now, dogs here, those of you who are pet lovers could perhaps say, oh, well, all right. But the way in which this is said is not complimentary. In fact, to be called a dog, and you have to be careful, of course, of the language here, but he in fact calls, suggests to the woman the word dog, and this is not pet, but these are the wild dogs, but has a deeper insult to it. You don't give it to the son of a bitch. Now, I know that's not language that we would be accustomed to hearing in church, but as one looks at the language in which Mark writes this, that would be kind of truly why we call this, on the part of Jesus, an insulting remark. And all of that is a little bit of background. Now, what the woman does, of course, is that she says to Jesus, yes, but even the crumbs that fall from the table of the children are picked up by, the dogs, if you want, underneath. And in fact, she changes it from being an insulting statement to a kind of, well, children know how to take care of pets, and they are to be considered here. So, again, the direct quote is, let the children first eat all that they want, for it is not right to take food from the children and throw it to the little dogs. Children here is understood to be the people of Israel, to be Israelites. Now, this is linked also to narratives that have gone before, where Jesus indeed has fed large numbers of people. In chapter 6 of this gospel, 5,000, you remember, were fed by the Sea of Galilee. And coming up in the 8th chapter of Mark is the second account of Jesus feeding, this time 4,000 people, but in Gentile territory. So there is a background here of food, feeding those who are hungry. This brutally statement on the part of Jesus requires considerable explanation, or at least as much as we can we know. Why does Jesus, as I mentioned, refuse to heal the daughter of this woman? Could it be because of her gender and her violation of Jesus' male space? After all, in this society, women do not talk to men, even in the Judaic, but certainly in the Greek-Roman culture, she is breaking boundaries. Is it therefore because of her race, in which the belief of the Tyrians is opposed to that of the God of Israel, to the God that Jesus believes? So these are kind of questions now that begin to emerge here. The exchange, certainly, or that takes place between this nameless mother, by the way, she doesn't get a name, persuades Jesus to abandon his refusal and to carry out an exorcism. Now also notice here that the daughter is filled with an devil or evil spirit, and Jesus, pictured as the healer throughout Mark's story, is pictured as, well, why doesn't he do this? He is in the territory of Tyre. Why he is there, we don't know. We do know something about Tyre, that it was economically, strategically placed as a city that had dominance over surrounding villages by extracting from them supplies, labor, and food. And so all of that might be, but again, why is Jesus in the territory? The woman is identified as Syro-Phoenician. It's one of the only Gospels, by the way, in which this title is given to her. And it still doesn't explain why this harshness on the part of Jesus. This is unparalleled in any of the Gospels that Jesus treats people or a person in this way. Also, in this episode with the woman, there is no mention of faith. The fact that she asks for help does not mean that she believes in Jesus or in the God of Jesus, but does believe that he can help her. Now, it's interesting that the woman retorts the insulting metaphor with a counter metaphor. Namely, she compares herself to a house pet. And in the Greek culture and world, often pets were allowed to come to the meals. Interestingly, in the Jewish custom, pets were kept outside. They were not brought into the meeting place. So what we are beginning to notice is that there's a change of attitude on the part of Jesus in dealing with and in helping Gentiles, that is, non-Jewish members, okay? And the woman kind of nicely says to Jesus, you know, children show kindness to a pet dog. What about you? Are you going to not show kindness to this woman? Now, some have pointed out that one of the reasons why this story is here and why it's important to notice is that there is an array of boundary crossings. These were not allowed or were not particularly encouraged, certainly in the first century world. First of all, Jesus himself has crossed a boundary by leaving Israeli territory and moving to a non-Jewish territory. And in case you didn't know, the Tyrenians were bitter enemies of the Jews. So why would Jesus move there or go there? Now some say he just wanted to get away from the activities that he was doing. And you know that these are ways in which we kind of cover up, or hopefully interpreters explain why the attitude of Jesus takes place. Certainly the boundary has been crossed here in that men and women didn't certainly publicly engage in any kind of a dialogue. Certainly the boundary of Jew and Gentile. Woman is a Gentile, Jesus is a Jew. And in fact, I know this sounds terrible, but Jesus' harsh words could be expected in some ways, because males were in the culture that we're talking about, and this would be a culture not only of the Gentiles, but also of the Jews. So simply, women were expected to kind of take this kind of retort, and the woman courageously challenges Jesus' saying. So looking at the boundaries that have been crossed, Jesus and the woman and the response that is made are all boundaries which socially and economically and politically kept the Jewish community or Jewish members from the Gentile or Greek-speaking world. So is this what lies behind some of the material we hear here? Also, in this episode, keeping in mind that Mark, and that's what we're looking at, how Mark develops this, is also aware of the two great heroes or prophetic heroes of the old world, namely Elijah and Elisha. And could it also be, and these are stories that one assumes the hearer of Mark's gospel is familiar with, that Elijah had helped a woman at Saphrata, and that Elisha later on, the successor, you remember, to Elijah, had helped a Sumanite, a woman, and in fact had cured her son when he had become seriously ill and brought him back to health. So all of that is background in some way to a story that puts Jesus really, as I mentioned before, in a very uncomfortable light. As I say, was it because of her gender and her violation of Jesus' male space? Was it because of her race, as one thought to be opposed to God? And of course, everyone kind of likes this. The title of this, of course, is The Sassy Mother and Her Daughter, because one can understand the woman places not her concerns, but those of her daughter first, and is willing to do anything that she can to help bring her daughter to good health, to restore her to the health that she had. So she serves certainly as an admirable mother. Some smile and say, and it's true, in the stories that are remembered about Jesus, it's the only time that Jesus changes his mind because of, well, a rhetorician or rhetorical response of the woman. And so some smile and say, for once, a man is put in his place because of the way in which he tries to deal with a woman. Well, all of that might be nice interpretation on the part of those who will look at this story. But certainly it is interesting that the mind of Jesus seems to be changed by this encounter. Now, in fact, her daughter is cured of the evil spirit that holds her, and it again is one of those episodes in which Jesus makes a cure without being in the presence of the one who is sick, and without, in many of the healings that have taken place in Mark's story, Jesus touching the person who is ill or sick. So it is by his word that the healing takes place. So all of this is a kind of interesting story, is it not, in which the mother, whose determined and compassionate efforts on behalf of her daughter brings about a healing and a cure for her daughter. It is, by the way, the third time that a daughter is mentioned in Mark's story. Earlier on had been the story of Jairus' daughter, you remember, who had been sick, and Jesus had come and healed her. And then the other daughter was the daughter of Herodias, who had been responsible for asking for the head of John the Baptist, and therefore his martyrdom. So this is the third time that, interestingly, a daughter is mentioned in Mark's story as Jesus being being related somewhat to Jesus. John the Baptist, of course, is related to Jesus, but as we have talked in earlier times, in a different way. So all of that is part of the episode that leads to what we will be looking at this time. This time, we find Jesus leaving the territory of Tyre and Sidon. So notice that's why I mentioned this at the beginning, and comes to what is known as the Decapolis. Now, the Decapolis territory, the word itself means 10 cities, which would have been a group of Hellenistic cities east of the Jordan River and east of the Sea of Galilee, and was distinguished by the fact that there were Jews who did also live in these places. Now you can check it out. We know the names a little bit of some of these places, but we're not quite sure where Jesus takes, or the episode in this gospel takes place, where Jesus is. Now, what is the episode here that we are looking at this time is that there is a man who is deaf and has trouble speaking. And now, a little bit of a discussion about the Greek word deaf sometimes can mean mute. So keep in mind, we're kind of examining the way in which these episodes unfold. To flesh out the story where it's going, Jesus does heal the man. We'll look at the way in which he does it, and people are amazed again, which is a characteristic of Mark's story, at Jesus' ability to heal. So he is certainly, in Mark's story, as we've noticed, a man of action, and this would be one. All right. Now, a deaf man who has trouble speaking. Now, or as one of the translations that we'll hear this time, was unable to speak properly. So it isn't that he can't speak, but that, and you can see how this would be connected with his ability to hear, and why he would be unable to speak. So we may not have here someone who is congenitally deaf, that is, who has no hearing at all, but rather whose hearing is so befuddled that it affects his ability to communicate by word. All right, so all of that, a little bit of a background here, that there is a connection between deafness and speaking, and the muddleness of this is what is maybe to be observed here. All right, Jesus then says, all right, let me talk to the man. He asks that he see him in private. Now, private, keep in mind that in this world, nothing is private. People know what is going on. People even know what is being said here. So please do not think when Jesus takes the man in private that it's the way we might think, like into another room or another place where people are. No. Perhaps best understood here in private means that Jesus would like to have a little elbow room, a little breathing space for himself and his client. It doesn't mean that he's terribly away from them and that they don't see or notice what he was doing. Now, Jesus lays his hand on the, and this is the usual way in which healings takes place, because it was believed that healing was transmitted, the power to heal, through the power of touch, or the ability of touch. Now, there are a couple of things here that happen that might not immediately you might not approve immediately by your sensitivity. First of all, he is pictured as spitting. Now, interpreters, and there are many authors who take these sections of Mark's story and try to find out what lies behind it. There are three possibilities as to what this spit or spittle. The idea of the spittle is that there is a power in that spittle, okay, especially if it comes from the healer. So you have to kind of go culturally with what was contemporary to the time. One, he could spit on the ground as a sign of contempt for the evil spirit. Secondly, that he spits on his fingers and subsequently touches the man's tongue. Or three, he spits into the man's mouth. Now, the more common of these three interpretations is the second, that he kind of touches the man's mouth. Jesus sighs. What does that mean? Well, there's interpreters about sighing. This is deep feeling. Does Jesus picture as having compassion for the sufferer? Some of these are interesting, okay? The man's tongue is unshackled. Now, we might use the word today, the guy was tongue-tied, okay? This is the language that is used by those who exercise others. All right, so notice, as you kind of hear this quickly, just to point out that actually, as Marcus presented it, there were 6 steps. Jesus takes the man aside, number 1. Secondly, he touches the man's ears. Thirdly, he spits. And by the way, there was a story of how the Emperor Vespasian had used his spittle to cure someone. So does Mark know that episode and kind of say Jesus is a little bit better than the emperor could be? We don't know. 4, he touches the man's tongue. 5, he looks heavenward and sighs. And 6, he issues a command with regard to the healing. So I just mentioned how very artistically, carefully Marcus set up this story. By the way, this episode is not found in Matthew or Luke, so this is one of those stories which uniquely belongs to the Markan tradition. And Jesus then says, don't tell anybody about what I have done. We always kind of smile at that, because when you tell someone not to do something, you almost inevitably are setting it up that they will, and that the story will spread quickly. Now, why does Jesus thrust his finger into the man's ear? And some say, well, he did that in order to create a passageway in through the man's ear, so that the evil spirit could come out. So you got to keep in mind the different ways in which this episode has been interpreted. He uses the word ephata, and he does not translate it. It is a Aramaic word, and it is interesting. There are certain places in the Gospel of Mark where he uses the Aramaic word and does not translate it, and this is one of them, because there is a theory also that sometimes in translating a word that has power, you are reducing the power of what is going to happen, so therefore you keep it the way it is. So there's another kind of way of interpreting this. So it's a very interesting passage. Jesus is unshackles the man's hearing. The great Charles Wesley hymn, which is not part of our Catholic tradition, but is a very popular hymn within the many of the Protestant traditions, "Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing," writes this, and I just thought it might be a nice little quote to remember. Here's how it goes. Now remember, it should be sung. This is the words to it. "Hear him, ye deaf, his praise, ye dumb. Your loosened tongues employ. You blind, behold your Savior come, and leap, ye lame, for joy." Well, okay, so it's a popular kind of episode that is taken into this gospel story. In conclusion, just a word about James. We will try to refer to this letter a little more in depth. Jesus here, James says here, be careful that you don't show people more respect and dignity because of the clothes that they wear. Now, I know this issue of clothing can be of concern, but he pictures that when two strangers come into the community, their status is determined by the kind of garments that they wear. Well, thank goodness we don't make judgments based on that. And of course, one of the points consistently made throughout the letter attributed to James is that everyone should be treated equally. There was a rabbinic teaching which argued against favoritism, and perhaps that is picked up also by James, who wants his community not to play favorites with one another, but to treat each one with the same dignity and respect. There were various, as you remember, social statuses that were part of the times, between rich and poor, between teachers and elders, between those who were ordinary workers. All of this is material that we've noticed before, but will be further developed by the letter to James. So in conclusion, this time, once again, as Jesus opens or makes the ability to the man whose hearing was not so good, able to speak plainly and clearly, may we, as we hear the word of Jesus this time, in curing the hearing man, be truly open to, and by the way, Jesus protects everyone's honor here because when he says, don't tell anyone, secrecy, you remember, was always invoked because they thought there was some deception or lying here. There is only the truth of Jesus' goodness in this story. May we be open, we hope that we are open to that truth and to speak it clearly and plainly. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.